Speaking with Rohan Edrisinha, the head of the Legal and Constitutional Unit of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, on a matter that has arisen out of the presidential elections recently concluded in Sri Lanka. Rohan, there seems to be confusion and concern that over the actual date that the executive president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, elected for the second term, will take office for his second term. There have been a number of reports in the media, again, very confused and confusing. Can you just work us through the issues that are here? And two chief concerns. One is the public perception that the term might actually start now 2 years hence, leading to an actual term of 8 years. And these questions and concerns about the date on which oaths will be taken to begin this new term of office.
Well, there is some confusion, and this is mainly because the Constitution itself has a very complicated section dealing with this question. And so there are different interpretations possible. But let's just go back in time. When the Constitution was first introduced in 1978, the intention was that a president is elected for a fixed 6-year term, and therefore it was pretty predictable as to when the presidential elections were going to be held and when a re-elected president would assume office. What happened was that J.R. Jayawardena, after a while, began to wish that he had the discretion that a prime minister has under a parliamentary executive model, where, as you know, a prime minister has discretion as to when he calls a general election to seek re-election. So what did J.R. Jayawardena do? In classic J.R. Jayawardena fashion, he amended the Constitution so as to achieve his objective. And so there was introduced in 1982 the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which basically allowed a president who was elected for a 6-year term, after 4 years, to have discretion as to when he wanted to call a presidential election at which he would seek re-election. And this is exactly what J.R. Jayawardena made use of in 1982. He called an early presidential election, won re-election, and then he was sworn in for his second term on a particular date, and we'll come back to that question in a little while. Chandrika Kumaratunga did the same thing, and now Mahinda Rajapaksa has also opted for this early presidential election. Now, if you look at the Third Amendment to the Constitution, the text is absolutely clear. It is a bizarre provision. I'm not defending the text at all, but the text makes it absolutely clear that if we were to apply it to the present case, Mahinda Rajapaksa, his second term begins on the date that corresponds to the date on which his first term began. Illogical, but that's what the text says. So if you were to apply it to the present scenario, since Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected to his first term in November 2005, his second term should begin in November 2010. Why? Because it is the date after the election, which corresponds to the date on which his first term began. Note, it is not that his second term begins in November 2011, after his first 6-year term ends. There's a common misconception that that is the case. It is very simply that it is on the date that corresponds to the date of his first election after the election. So it's November 2010. Now, this is what the text says. It's probably bad in terms of principle, in terms of policy, but the text is absolutely clear. And this is precisely what happened when J.R. Jayawardena was re-elected. He was re-elected in October 1982, but because his first term was deemed to have begun in February 1978, Chief Justice Neville Samarakun swore him in for his second term in February 1982. No one raised any concerns about that, probably because the gap between October and February was just 4 months. The controversy arose again in 1999 when Chandrika Kumaratunga had an early presidential election, and then instead of being sworn in on the date that corresponded to the election, her first election, Chief Justice Sarath Silva made a mistake and swore her in immediately after the results were announced in 1999. And some of us noticed this, we raised this as a public issue, people ignored it, until of course it became a controversy in 2005. If there's a dispute about when your term begins, there'll obviously be a dispute about when your term ends. And then what happened was, some people went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to determine when Chandrika Kumaratunga's second term ended. They had to obviously go into the question of when her second term began. The irony was, of course, that Sarath Silva, who made the mistake in swearing her in the first place, presided over the court that heard this particular issue and had to determine this issue. And Sarath Silva basically gave a determination that validated his mistake and held that Chandrika Kumaratunga's term began when she took her oaths soon after the declaration of the results. So, what do we have here? We have the text and the conduct of Neville Samarakun pointing in the direction of Mahinda Rajapaksa's second term beginning in November 2010. But we have the practice of the previous president and the Supreme Court determination of Sarath Silva pointing in the direction of the fact that Mahinda Rajapaksa's second term should begin on the date that the results were announced, that is 27th of January 2010. And so Chief Justice Asoka de Silva has a choice. He has two options, both of which have their strengths and their limitations. Sarath Silva's approach, that the term begins when the election results are announced, appeals to common sense. It probably appeals to international best practice. You don't want to have a situation where an election is held on a particular date, but the effect of that election becomes operational about 10 months later. So it's a tricky issue. And Chief Justice Asoka de Silva has to decide whether he wants to follow the text or whether he wants to follow a kind of common sense policy approach. And everyone now waits to see what Asoka de Silva will do. One possible solution, and probably the most principled one, would be for this matter to be referred to the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, for Chief Justice Asoka de Silva to constitute a 5 or even a full bench of all the Supreme Court justices, for it to be absolutely open so that various parties who have an interest in this case can make their submissions, and for the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka to acknowledge that there is a conflict, if you like, a conflict between text and principle, a conflict between what Chief Justice Samarakun did and what Chief Justice Sarath Silva said in his determination, and reach a principled conclusion. And I would hope that this is done in the present scenario.
Rohan, what is the time that we are talking about to consider that option that you just talked about right now?
Well, the complicating factor is, of course, that the President is supposed to take his oaths for the commencement of any term, including a second term, within 2 weeks of him having to, within 2 weeks of him assuming office. So if the position is that his office, his second term commences on the 27th of January, then there'll be some pressure on him to take his oaths within 2 weeks of the 27th of January. But our Constitution does allow for the Supreme Court to be asked a question and to be required to respond to that question through a determination within even 24 or 48 hours. And I do think that if President Rajapaksa were to sort of take a statesman-like approach and say, well, I want the Supreme Court to determine this matter, I'm not going to decide, and ask the Supreme Court to address this question as a matter of urgency, given the issues involved, I don't think it will be impossible for such a determination to be given within a week or 2 weeks.